My name is Bruce Kane, and I'm the faculty director for the Bill Lane Center for the American West, which is one of the co-sponsoring organizations for this Knight-Risser Symposium. According to Jeff McGee, who is our local historian, among other things, this is our 11th symposium, and we're quite pleased every year. We look forward to this event. I'm just going to say a few things, and then I'm going to hand it over. Our pattern is to have one Bruce and two Jims, so we're going to stick to our traditional pattern of following a Bruce with two Jims. And before I bring Jim Bettinger up, I just want to say a little bit about the topicality of this. I mean, as you can see, the topic of air pollution is something we in California think about quite a bit, not necessarily with respect to fracking, but certainly we've had our problems with it. I spend a lot of time in Texas and Oklahoma because of my wife, so I'm going to be quite interested in listening to the panel. And there's hardly a day when you can't pick up the news these days and see the environment in the news, whether we're talking about Flint, whether we're talking about Porter Ranch and the methane leaks in California, or whether we're talking about what the Supreme Court appointment will mean for the Clean Power Plan that Obama has put into place. It just seems like the environment has jumped back into the news, which is important, and there's no question that an important part of trying to get the policy right is getting the reporting right, so that we really understand the facts of what's going on so that we can think about how to meet these environmental challenges. So the Bill Lane Center is honored to be part of this. We think it's a very important thing to honor, to get first-rate investigative journalism supported. The news media has been under siege for about 15 or 20 years now with the changing market of print media, with the rise of blogging, and apparently the inability of people to discern quality reporting from just rumor spreading. And so it's really important that traditional investigative media that really tells us the facts in a well-sourced way, that we continue to support that, because otherwise there's no way that we're going to get our policy straight. So with that, I want to hand over the podium to Jim Bettinger, who is the head of the Knight-Risser program, and he will introduce the rest of the program to you.
Well, welcome to you all. It's my honor to introduce Jim Risser, who's the guy with his name on the prize. Jim was a professional journalism fellow here at Stanford in 73, 74, and he returned to the Des Moines Register, where he was eventually its Washington bureau chief, and won 2 Pulitzer Prizes in the years right after his fellowship. The first was in 1976. And it was exposing corruption in grain inspector program. The second was in 1979, and it wrote about the harm that current farming practices were doing to the environment. Jim became director of the Knight Fellowship Program in 1985 and led it to the prominence that it has today. When he retired in 2000, Knight Fellowship alumni raised money to create this prize and the symposium, because Jim had had a keen interest in the West and in Western environmental issues, and that's why it is framed this way. It dovetailed nicely with the interest of the Lane Center as well. A generous matching grant from the Knight Foundation put the symposium and the prize on an endowed basis, and as Bruce mentioned, this is the 11th year that the prize has been awarded. Almost every year, Jim has been able to be with us to actually award the prize, and I ask him to do that now. Jim Risser.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Bruce. I'm proud to be here. I retired from Stanford a few years back, and Jim took over as head of the Knight Fellowship Program. My wife and I now live in Ashland, Oregon, which is a nice place to be, but it's also nice to come back to Stanford every now and then, and particularly to help hand out this prize. I'm very proud of this prize, the fact that it was set up, and that, as Bruce and Jim have both said, it's important because it encourages and rewards good reporting about the West, which we know is an area of massive, strong, but fragile, if that's not contradictory, environment that needs protecting and watching at all times. So I'm glad to be here to take part in this. I'm going to go right ahead now and just announce the winners of the prize. The winner is a project that resulted in a report called Big Oil, Bad Air. It was set in the Texas oil fields, and it demonstrated how hydraulic fracturing or fracking operations there have caused air pollution and illness among the residents of that area. In addition, the report documented very vividly Texas's lax regulation of the industry. An unusual feature, at least for this prize, an unusual feature of this journalistic endeavor was that it was done by 3 organizations, not just one. The 3 are the Center for Public Integrity, Inside Climate News, and the Weather Channel. The core project team was made up of reporters Jim Morris of the Center for Public Integrity, Lisa Song and David Hazemeyer of Inside Climate News, Susan West, former executive editor of Inside Climate News, and Greg Gilderman, a producer with the Weather Channel. All of them were involved in the work on this study, this report. Here today to receive the Weather Channel, to receive the Knight-Risser Prize for West Environmental Journalism are 2 of those winners. I'm going to bring those 2 up here and give them a plaque. The other winners get plaques too, and everybody in this group also gets a money prize, which in this modern day and age is not in the form of a check. It's been done by direct deposit. So the 2 people who I would like to call up here are Jim Morris of the Center for Public Integrity and Susan White, who was at the time the executive editor of Inside Climate News and now is executive director of Inquire First. Would the 2 of you come up, please? Environmental journalism and their name on it. Very attractive plaque.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Congratulations. To
Thank
both
you
of
so
you.
much.
A lot of stuff here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, perfect. Should we do one more?
All right.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Are we on?
we're on.
Okay. Want to come up with me?
I will. We don't live near each other. We have not physically rehearsed this.
Yeah. Be patient, please. So back in the spring of 2013, I made a phone call to an editor I had never met to see if she'd like to join forces on a project that would become bigger and more fulfilling than I think either of us could have imagined. That editor is right here. Her name is Susan White. And at the time I called her, she was executive editor of Inside Climate News, which is a small, very scrappy publication with a small staff. I had heard about Susan from a mutual friend who thought that our organizations, the Center for Public Integrity and Inside Climate, might work well together. I had an idea that wasn't fully formed, but I knew that since so much of the media coverage of fracking to that point had focused on worries about groundwater, and since the film Gasland, which was, I think it came out a year or 2 before that, and other media attention had zeroed in mainly on the Marcellus Shale up in the Northeast, I thought it might be interesting to look at air pollution associated with one of the biggest but least covered shale plays in the nation at the time, which was the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas. So Susan's publisher reached out to the Weather Channel, which at the time was just getting into the business of making environmental documentaries, to see if they'd like to join us. And they jumped at the chance. Having worked in Texas for many years, notably in Houston, which is one of the nation's most polluted cities, as I'm sure you know, I had a feeling we would not struggle to find material. This turned out to be quite an understatement. And I'll get into some specifics in a few minutes, but we want to give you a flavor of what we encountered. So if we can, let's just look at the first minute or so of the 15-minute Weather Channel documentary, please.
The flame over there, that the whole sky is like burning. I mean, it looks like an inferno or something.
There's stuff coming up into my throat and my nose is shutting down and I can't get a breath.
Texas was a very poor agrarian state until oil was discovered. And I would suggest that in large measure our state government is both funded and controlled by this industry.
I can control what my kids eat, I can control what goes on their skin, but I can't control the air that's coming across from the neighbors.
Being 40 miles back on some ranch with nothing but a little indicator that says the H2S is present in the area, that stuff's so dangerous, there's 1,000 parts per million, you're dead.
Hi. We also have, okay, here's the map. Down. Better? Good. Okay. This map shows the oil and gas wells that are drilled or are permitted to drill in this largely rural area of Texas. It's shocking for us to look at. It's still shocking to me, but it's especially shocking for the people who live there. And it's because of those people that I joined this project when Jim called. Between 2008 and 2010, I had been editing Abram Lusgarten's groundbreaking work on oil and gas drilling at ProPublica. And I had lived with the stories that he was telling me of people who were complaining to federal, state, and local officials about symptoms they were seeing, about problems primarily there with their water. And nothing was done. So this time, now the stories are of people having trouble with the air they breathe. So our feeling was, if the regulators and politicians who are charged with protecting these people are not giving them the answers, then we would have to use the power of journalism to get the answers for them. So the people that we wrote about played a big role. The woman that you saw at the beginning, her name is Lynn Buring. And Lynn and Shelby Buring live in a small house in the middle of nowhere. They live a very modest life and a very happy life, I think. Their biggest pleasure has always been sitting on the back porch and enjoying the vast expanse of the Texas sky. And if you've been to Texas, it's beautiful, it's stunning, that wonderful open space. But then, within a space of a couple years, 50 oil and gas wells were drilled within 2.5 miles of their house, plus another 9 oil and gas facilities were built in that area. Now, we couldn't find information about 6 of those facilities because in Texas, they were not required to file their air emissions with the state. We did find information about 3 of the facilities, and we found that the state of Texas allowed those 3 facilities each year to emit 189 tons of volatile organic compounds, which include benzene and formaldehyde. And they were emitting that into rural Texas, not into a big city urban development area, which is more likely to be closely monitored. The Burings Lynn Buring had always suffered from asthma. She used a breathing machine usually twice a month. Then she began to use her breathing machine. She required it twice a week and sometimes twice a day. She also developed debilitating migraines. So today, Lynn does not join her husband on the back porch anymore because most days she can't breathe the air. The Burings were just one of the many families we interviewed, and their story was not the worst.
So I said a few minutes ago that I knew we'd have no shortage of material, and I knew this because I had covered the oil, gas, and chemical industries in Texas for many years and was familiar with the hands-off approach that the regulatory agencies down there took. But even I must admit, when I made my first trip to South Texas for the project that would become a big oil bad air, things were even worse than I had remembered. I had moved from Houston to the Washington, D.C. area 14 years earlier and was struck by how much more intense the anti-regulatory feeling had become down there. So that first trip, which was in June of 2013, was among 8 that either I or Susan's reporters, Lisa Song and Dave Hasemeyer, would take down to Texas. Our experiences were so bizarre that we decided to write a separate story about them. In that piece, among other things, we noted that the agency responsible for regulating air emissions, which is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ, refused to make any of its commissioners, investigators, or any of their officials, for that matter, available for either phone or face-to-face interviews. So all of our questions, and believe me, there were a lot over a period of 18 months, everything had to be submitted in writing, and the answers, such as they were, came back the same way, if there were answers. At one point, Dave, Susan's reporter, grew so frustrated with the stonewalling that he started calling investigators at their homes. This prompted an angry voicemail from one of the TCEQ spokespeople who sternly admonished Dave to stop doing that. Anyone who knows Dave knows that this is like pouring gasoline on a fire. He kept calling, of course. The drilling regulator, which has a strange name, it's the Texas Railroad Commission, but they regulate a lot better. It did make one commissioner available to me for a 10-minute phone interview, but at the last minute canceled an appointment for an on-camera interview with the Weather Channel. The commissioner was said to be sick and unavailable for the next month. He must have been pretty sick. Like the TCEQ, the Railroad Commission made us submit all questions in writing. Industry officials were equally shy about meeting us or appearing on camera. The 3 organizations, I think, worked together remarkably well, given that none of us had done so before. Susan, who's based in San Diego, and I had multiple conversations each week. I think we all became part of a single team, sharing tips, travel, notes, ideas, and gripes, a lot of gripes. The end result was a powerful documentary, 15-minute film, and more than 40 stories that examined everything from the incestuous relationship between the oil and gas industry and the Texas legislature to the witch's brew of chemicals that spew mostly unchecked from wells, storage tanks, and processing plants. Was it worth 18 months of our time? It absolutely was. One reader said he had recently driven through the Eagle Ford on his way to Arizona and had, quote, never seen the scope or intensity of destruction as I witnessed on that trip, close quote. He thanked us for shedding light on the region, which had been mostly ignored by the media. In fairness, I should add that another reader suggested we, quote, close your doors and go away. The damage you do to the economy under the name of environmental concerns is unacceptable and a problem for our country, not a solution, close quote. And another accused us of being, quote, hysteria mongers, close quote. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
I want to thank the judges of the Knight-Risser Prize for honoring both of our organizations with this award. It really means a lot to us because, especially being online organizations, we often don't get a lot of personal feedback. So really, these things really do mean a lot. And I also wanted to emphasize again the importance of the work that big oil bad air represents. Inside Climate News and the Center for Public Integrity devoted 18 months to this project, and that is an amazing thing in this era of fast and dirty journalism. It represented a huge financial investment for both organizations, and it also represented an emotional commitment on the part of the journalists because, as you know, I mean, we lived with the stories, the reporters lived with the stories. They wanted to do their best to represent the people involved, but at the same time, because we're journalists, they felt a tremendous obligation to fairly represent the industries that they were writing about and the regulators, even though both did everything they can to make it difficult, even for us, to get information that was favorable to them. So this work was very hard, and we appreciate the award tremendously. There's a lot more work to be done in Texas. The air is probably a little cleaner there right now, not because the Texas regulators took heed of our warning and reformed their system, but because the oil boom is temporarily a bust. But it will come back. And I don't think any of us here who worked on this project is confident that when it does come back, that the Texas regulators will do a better job of representing the people as well as they represent the gas and oil industry. More stories are needed, but it's going to be up to other organizations to pick up where we left off because our organizations did our part. And that's one of the things that has always bothered me about journalism. I've been around a long time, and like those of you here, I've worked on countless projects where we expose something, we do this amazing work, and then we have to move on to the next project. And what I have found is often the people who do the bad deeds, as soon as we go away, they emerge again, and you could go back in a few years and write the same story again. So to me, it's almost like we go in and we persuade people to share their very most personal stories with us, and then we leave them in midair. We sort of walk away and we cross our fingers, because we really do care, but we cross our fingers and hope that they land safely now that our backs are turned. So that has bothered me so much that more than a year ago, I left Inside Climate News to begin forming a new kind of journalism organization. We're calling ourselves Inquire First, and we're only going to focus on 2 to 3 subjects a year, subjects of critical national importance, and we're going to stick with those subjects until something happens. And you know, even if that takes several years, we're going to be there. And part of the time we will, one aspect of this is that we're going to create virtual town halls for each project, so that, and we're going to invite the public to weigh in. We're going to try to appeal to the public in different ways, and then we can give them daily updates and hold people accountable as time goes on. This is, of course, what I'm talking about is very ambitious, and it's new territory for the dozen or so journalists who are part of our group, but we're determined to succeed because we really believe that people like the Burings, like Lynn and Shelby Buring, need to have unbiased, factual information if they're to have any chance of having a voice in the public debates that are so often shaped by business and political interests. And I happen to believe that it's people like us, the journalists in this room, who have a moral obligation to find ways to keep doing that work so that these people get the information they need. So thank you again for the prize. Jim and I are very happy. And we'll take it home to our reporters, and they'll be very happy.
Thank you.
Is this one mine? Yes.
I think that's you.
I'm first.
Thank you. Is Jessica Garretson here? Yes. Could you open up? So Jessica Garretson of BuzzFeed News was awarded a special citation by the judges for the stories that she did about the impact of the warehouses used for sort of overnight shipping in the Inland Empire. And as somebody who lived and worked in Riverside for 15 years, I've seen that impact quite a bit. So we congratulate you on your award.
Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to ask the panelists to come up, and while they are, I want to introduce Sasha Coca. Sasha is the person who's going to moderate today's discussion. She's the KQED Central Valley Bureau Chief, where she covers the nation's most productive farm belt, some of its poorest cities, and its easily its most beautiful national parks. She's also a past winner of a Knight-Risser Special Citation. Sasha?
Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real honor to be celebrating the fabulous work that Jim and Susan have done exposing the problems with fracking and air pollution in Texas. And, you know, I'm really, as a breather and as a journalist, you know, I'm personally indebted to you guys for pushing the field of environmental journalism to take us back, you know, to really examining air pollution through the complex lens that you all did, because here we are nearly 50 years after the passage of the Clean Air Act in the United States. And air pollution is not just a problem in Beijing or Mexico City or New Delhi, but it is a problem right here in the United States, and not only in Texas, but also right here in California. I work and live in the San Joaquin Valley, which is one of the most polluted air basins in the country. I'm raising 2 small children there who are also breathers, and we have similar problems despite the fact that we are in one of the most progressive environmental states in the nation. We have limited monitoring, there's a lack of information, and we are often breathing in a toxic soup. I was just telling Susan there, you know, more than 100 days a year, my children cannot play outside because either the ozone or particulate matter levels are too high and dangerous for their lungs. So we're going to expand out the conversation a little bit and not only talk with Jim and Susan a little bit more about how they did their project, but also invite a couple of other folks into the conversation so we can really dig into this issue about where we stand right now in terms of our air pollution problems in the US and in the West. So I'd like to introduce Madeline Stano. She is an attorney with the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, which is based in Oakland, but also in Delano, California, which is in Kern County, down in my neck of the woods. It's the heart of California's oil and gas boom, and also of our agricultural industry. I think probably almond capital of the world in Kern County. And Madeline litigates around climate change and environmental and racial justice. She's got a really interesting case right now where she's representing a dad and his 2 daughters in terms of challenging the state of California for their failure to protect public school children from fracking-related pollution, and I'm hoping we can hear more about that case. She also serves on the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum on Climate Change and the Californians Against Fracking Steering Committee. And by way of introduction, we've got a short video clip from a campaign that Madeline's been involved in recently.
Polluting our drinking water during the worst drought in 1,200 years?
Some would call that insane.
Stupid.
That's crazy.
In California, we call it fracking.
Hey, Jerry Brown.
You don't where you eat.
And you don't frack where you drink.
Ban fracking in California.
Ban fracking in California.
ban fracking in California.
Polluting our...
All right, and Danny Cullenwood is an energy economist and an attorney working on the design and implementation of scientifically grounded climate policy. Imagine that. He was a research fellow at UC Berkeley, where he taught climate law and policy, and he's also provided pro bono representation to environmental scientists in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and the US Supreme Court. He got his law degree and his PhD in environment and resources right here from Stanford University. And he's endeared himself to those of us who are journalists by playing something of a whistleblower role in the past. He's a public scientist who criticized California air and climate regulators for what he says is quietly backtracking on climate regulations, and I hope you will tell us more about that. And you know, I want to start off the conversation by really digging in a bit more to your project, Jim and Susan. I mean, I think what you've done here is to ask some really hard questions about, can you trust the laws? Can you trust the regulation? You know, can you trust the data? And what are the holes in the system that's designed to protect us from air pollution? And Texas, as we know, is a very stark example of what happens when there seems to be very little or no regulation actually in place. And so I wonder if you could just, sort of start there in terms of extracting out some of the larger truths for us about what this tells us about systemic failure nearly 50 years after the Clean Air Act.
Mind if I start?
You go. Go.
I'll go.
Go.
I think a lot of people, not this group, but a lot of people perhaps don't understand that although the Clean Air Act is a federal law, the enforcement is trusted in the states. And whether it's California or Texas, that's where something either gets done or doesn't get done. They think, people think, oh, the Clean Air Act, the EPA will just step in and take care of situations like we reported on. That's couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, I've had occasion to be part of projects that involved regulations for several years. Inside Climate won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on a pipeline break, an oil pipeline break in Michigan. It's called the Dilbert Disaster, and you can get it on Amazon. It's really it's a great little book. But what we learned then was when this oil pipeline broke, and it was a different kind of oil, and the regulators didn't know what kind of oil it was, and it emitted all these fumes, and people had to leave their homes. But the regulators right away came out and said, everything is fine, there is no harm, blah, blah, blah. But the deeper we dug into the science, you realize that the science is often corrupt. If there is any science, or the science that is available does not apply to the people who are involved in that particular situation. So I have seen that now with the pipeline break, and I saw it with water contamination where when ProPublica was doing oil and gas fracking stories about water in the Marcellus, and everyone would say everything's fine, you're imagining it, but when you dig deeper, you realize it isn't really fine. It may be okay, but people don't really know. And the Porter Ranch story now I follow from afar because I'm not involved in that. But because of what I know about other situations, my feeling is, do they really know what they're saying? The commonly used phrase is the additive that people are smelling, the thing that's added to natural gas, so that if you smell it, you call the utility company and say, we have a leak, and they run over. Well, the science, I think, has only tested the reaction of people to that additive in short bursts, because you're not supposed to build, you breathe it for a few seconds and then you run to your telephone and someone runs out and fixes the problem. But these people are breathing it for a long time. Is the science there to say that it's okay that you can breathe this for months? So I find it really disillusioning. And I have now, I'm by nature an optimistic, upbeat person, but I have found myself in recent years becoming so skeptical of what people tell me. And the other thing I would like to say is, in all the projects I've been involved in, I and the reporters desperately want good news. I want regulators to tell me, yes, it's safe, and here's why. We really work hard to find those stories. It's not that we're just out there trying to search for bad news, because we do deep journalism, and that's different than running out and doing a daily. And I'm not finding those stories. And usually the deeper we dig, the more I find we don't know. So I think it's a major problem, and I think people should be skeptical all across the country. When people say something you're smelling or tasting is okay, it may be, but don't rely on what they say.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges in doing this kind of work is you find very compelling personal stories like those of the families that you profiled, but you don't necessarily have the scientific data to back that up. And you know, as journalists, but also as advocates or folks involved in the policy arena, what do you do with that information?
Well, I want to make one confession, and maybe Danny, this will be something that you can talk about, but as a journalist, in my long career, I have tended to steer clear of stories about people complaining about health ailments caused by XYZ. Because as a journalist, you know you are going to go down a deep, dark hole. And you are going to come up and you are not going to be able to say this is the way it is. But in recent years, primarily because I've been working with Lisa Song, who was the reporter on this series, Lisa has a science degree from MIT. And she has all the great characteristics also of a great journalist. And she has persuaded some of the best scientists in the world to talk to her, people who won't talk to other people, because she actually reads their papers, which is a way to start the conversation. She really reads their papers, and she calls them back again and again, and they know that she wants to understand. She's not looking for quick quotes. So because of her, I have been introduced to this very much more nuanced world where, yes, we are not going, in these stories, we did not prove that these people are suffering because of gas and oil drilling. But we do have enough scientists who trusted us enough to discuss in depth the reasons why we should be concerned. And that's a very difficult kind of reporting to do, but I think we all need to do more of it. And we need more scientists who will help us do that kind of work.
I wanted to just add, we looked at, what did we look at? There were a couple of hundred complaints that we found online throughout that whole Eagle Ford region, and I forget how many counties are in it now, but it's the size of Massachusetts, is that right?
Something like that.
And these were from various counties and different people, and they were so vivid. Kids with recurring nosebleeds, and people not being able to step outside without fainting. I mean, literally, it was that bad. And it's just, although it's anecdotal, it's hard to imagine that 200 different people from a huge area like that were somehow conspiring to,
and
come
one
up
of
with
the
that
scientists,
stuff.
remember one of the scientists Lisa interviewed said, no, we can't say that it's causing this, but there is enough commonality in these complaints that it deserves and demands more research. And then you enter another world, because getting the money for research is difficult.
And that was the frame, is that the lack of data is the point.
I should note too that once we made use of those complaints, which were very detailed and vivid, they didn't take them down, but they redacted them and made them one sentence. Because we pulled so much material from those complaints about, very detailed health conditions. And then a couple of months later, they were magically sanitized, so whatever that means.
So Danny, what's your tip for us as journalists about how we can break down that wall and speak the language of scientists and get the scientists to speak to us?
It's a tough question. And so I should just first say before I answer your question, I wanted to let folks know before I came to graduate school, I actually worked for an energy investment company that had investments in natural gas, including in the Eagle Ford Shale. I don't have any direct connection to that anymore, but thought that was worth mentioning to the group. So I think this is a really powerful question and a powerful issue. And as a scientist who has had work that I desperately wanted to get out, I struggled to make the reverse journey. So I think there's maybe some learning on both sides. I will say, if you ever read someone's paper before you call them, you've upped the readership by about 10%. And it's the most flattering thing you can ever do. I think that is a guaranteed way to get in. One of the challenges we have in the scientific community is that novelty is it's praised and valued most in that community. And there's a sort of insular nature, especially as the funding relationships become more strained and the politics of high-profile issues like fracking or air pollution are so difficult that it can easily cause headaches and controversy for the scientists who often view themselves as separate from the issue. And I think part of the problem is to have a broader discussion within the scientific community that I know a lot of my colleagues here at Stanford have begun and been having for a long time about the need to reach people who are outside of your immediate professional community. So one of the things I appreciated about your work was not only your efforts to get in touch with scientists, but also the really dogged approach of running down the regulator and saying what's going on and sticking with it and trying to connect all those pieces all together. So I really, as a scientist, I appreciate that.
Madeline, what was your takeaway? I know your work is very focused in California where communities may be affected by oil and gas development. What was your takeaway from reading Jim and Susan's work?
Well, I was impressed with what you were able to put on paper. In addition to the documentary and hearing folks speak for themselves, one of the principles of environmental justice. But, we struggled to get any scrap of information on this issue on paper from anyone. So the amount of paper that you were able to generate, in addition to really holding those regulators accountable over a long period of time, over a number of different issues, cross-jurisdictional, matrix of different stakeholders, you were able to tell a very clear and compelling story on a really complicated and charged issue. So I was impressed all around, and I was also reminded of my clients and of the story here in California. Unfortunately, I think you did a beautiful, well, fortunately and unfortunately, you did a beautiful job of highlighting symptoms of a much larger disease than is located alone in the Eagle Ford Shale. So my clients, similarly, when we started working in 2013, we saw new wells actually at the opening of a community garden. That was our official notice for an environmental justice nonprofit located, 15 minutes away where we were having an opening. Just new machinery. We're asking neighbors. We're on a community garden that is located on an elementary school in Shafter, California, asking teachers, what are these? When did these go up? No paper notice. Ask the city. No paper notice. Ask the state. No notice that any new activity was going on. And so we were in the back of a pickup truck just driving around trying to figure out anecdotally what was happening in California. Was it similar to what's happening in the Northeast? What's the technology, and what are the risks? And families, unfortunately, are the folks that have all of the information about what's really happening. People are exposed. It's not science that exists, in an academic sphere. It is the stories of people living and working and going to school, whose lives have been interrupted by a force that they have no meaningful information on, and were never given an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not they like it in their community.
Susan talked about the challenges of journalism in this regard, because sometimes it's hard to feel like we're being effective or making a difference or changing anything when we leave a project like this behind. But I'm curious, Danny and Madeline, how effective is litigation? I mean, you've got this one case where you're advocating on behalf of a father and his children. How much does that change things, especially when we're talking about a vast lack of regulation like we've seen here?
Well, many of the challenges of litigation were highlighted by their piece. So how do you prove an injury when there's no information from the regulators or any seen independent, credible, held up in court source? And in an area like the Central Valley, where you have the largest oil producing county in the United States, Kern County, that also huge agricultural emissions, you can't pinpoint necessarily which PM 2.5 particle is coming from which operator and under which circumstances. And so at the public school that I had just mentioned, you have 3 fracking wells within 1,200 feet of the elementary school that is less than 500 feet from a commercial almond orchard that is in the 99th percentile for pesticide application. So trying to build a case when those are the facts are really challenging. And I think the case, even though it is a legal uphill climb, it's around racial discrimination and the disparate impacts of citing decisions in California that overwhelmingly negatively impact folks of color, specifically Latino students. I think the case has been successful so far, even though we've had some legal setbacks, because of the journalists who covered it, because it was a way to tell a story credibly. And we would not have been able to do that if it just occurred in court with no audience. And we were able to work with journalists in California and across the country and across the world to get the story out there, because unfortunately in California and Texas, folks have a license to pollute. You don't have the right to clean air. Our permitting system is all built around, at the really zoomed out level, the Clean Air Act, which you mentioned, it is written to give industry rights to pollute and put stuff in the air. So we are not equipped. And so you have to come up with these Hail Mary kind of legal theories that I strongly believe in. It is active litigation, but you're put in a situation where we have to wait until after Rodrigo's daughter has severe epileptic attacks that she can't explain. Her best friend went into a respiratory attack that led to a coma. She passed away at 11 years old. We have no information on what exactly was leading to each of these things. And the law puts you in a place where you have to have these injuries in order to start holding folks accountable and learning more about this issue.
Can I say one more thing about the legal issue that's really interesting? When you have a good case too, often the companies settle and then everything is sealed. And that is the most frightening thing, because then it's gone. It's really wiped off the map. So you really can't have this paper trail.
Danny, you looked like you were...
Well, it's an interesting issue, and I completely respect the clients you're trying to work with. I think that's a really important interest to be protecting. I'm a little more skeptical even about the role of litigation. I mean, again, one of the most powerful features of your story, I thought, was showing how the regulator was really not interested in changing the way they operate. And I don't mean to sit here in California and tell Texas how to behave, but you're essentially asking a judge to do the same thing if you think that litigation is going to change the fundamental nature of the politics of regulation. And so I think it can be very helpful to address individual wrongs and to help raise awareness around what's going on. But to me, it's just part of a larger process that is going to be necessary to reform the way we deal with these issues. And the Clean Air Act, some people celebrate, the fact that it has done so much, and I think there's a lot to say about what positive changes have happened under it. One of the problems we have is it is quite old, and if you're trying to deal with new problems, especially the rapid emergence of new fracking technologies, it's not probably the best tool the way it's written right now. There's very little prospect of that changing in terms of legislation from the federal government. And so it's a very difficult position if a state does not want to push harder on an issue to try and make the state do something different. So that's just my perspective on that.
No, one of the things that struck me is, you guys interviewed somebody who said that basically the regulators were far more interested in compliance than in punishment, right? So if it's just this mentality that, you know, we don't want to slap people too hard on the wrist because otherwise they're just not going to listen to us at all, you know, then how do you really move the agenda? And I feel like, you know, here in California with some of our air districts, we have a pretty similar mentality, even though on paper there's, you know, the laws may seem to be more aggressive. California has its own stringent standards when it comes to air pollution. But where Madeline and I are in the San Joaquin Valley, you know, they're holding conferences at Yosemite to bring in people from around the world to talk about how our air pollution is caused by China, you know, not by industry, not by agriculture, not by the diesel trucks that are passing through the spine of the state.
Which is just true enough.
Right.
To be a salient claim. Yeah. It is part 10 to 20% most estimates. Crazy.
Do you know, it's an uncomfortable thing to say, but I think as our population grows, we live in more urban areas, that we're going to have more regulations, not fewer, and they're going to have to be much smarter and much better and more sophisticated. And I think we need those regulations to protect our water and our air. And we have to constantly be evaluating them. But right now, to change the regulations is very difficult, and industries weigh in, and it goes on for years, and your clients aren't going to get any help. And so I think as a society, as a country, we really have to rethink this, that regulations should be there for the benefit of all of us, and that they should be smart, and that we should have a system that can be updated as needed as technology evolves. And it's going to be an issue. It's not just the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, it's everything.
Mm-hmm. But as you pointed out, you know, how can you enforce if you're not monitoring? If you don't have the information.
No. And for scientists to get the grants, you know, Lisa talked to scientists. I would love to study XYZ, but you're not going to get the money. There are some things that are popular to study, and there are other things that are not popular.
We, if I can add to that, we talked to a scientist, remember Jay Olaguer? We talked to a scientist in Houston, very smart guy who had access to a mobile monitoring device, I don't know what you call it, just an air monitoring device. And he told me early in this project that he had offered to do monitoring in some of these little towns in South Texas for free. He would do it. He said he had no takers. Wow. Because people didn't want to know, in his view, what was out there. It was like, just don't tell me. So.
Wow. Do you think there is a role, though, for, I mean, if we're not having the regulators do the science, is there a role for community-based science, you know, for people who are doing their own monitoring at a community-based level, maybe, you know, through some of the organizations you work with, Madeline? And then how do we as journalists vet that? I mean, it's often very small sample sizes, and
we did a little story on, remember the group in Pennsylvania, were they in Pennsylvania that Lisa did, where they were having real problems, and a bunch of doctors and local scientists got together and they said, we can't let this go on. And so they came up with their own kind of monitor, and they did this other kind of study. But even so, I'm assuming that that will help to some extent, but that's not going to move the needle, whatever the cliche is that applies.
Danny, I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to share with us some of the work that you did in analyzing California's climate strategies, and want to hear a little bit more about the challenges in getting journalists to cover that.
So it's something very close to my personal experience, obviously, but actually as I was finishing up grad school here, and while I was working at UC Berkeley, I did a lot of work on the design of California's carbon market, which is one of the policies that the state is using to reduce its overall greenhouse gas emissions. And the work I uncovered, basically, as I was finishing up my time here, was a series of loopholes that the regulator had proposed on behalf of the utilities, the state utilities, that codified exemptions where the utilities could basically swap out-of-state power contracts to just move contracts around without affecting the physical operation of the grid. and book an accounting change related to those swaps that would demonstrate compliance in the carbon market. So it's not actual reduction, it's just an accounting trick across the state border to say the brown electrons go to somewhere else and the green electrons come here, according to the contracts, not the physical nature of the grid, which is this, it's operated at the speed of light, in an interconnected regional way. And it pretty clearly violated state law, and it was transparent. And one of the most interesting things about it was that the scientific advisors to the Air Resources Board, which is the government entity that's in charge of these regulations, they concluded the exact same thing. But they didn't say it in those words. They said, well, if you allow this to happen, all of these contracts will move and you'll produce the same outcome. And they very expressly withheld an opinion about whether or not the exemptions in the regulatory package did that, which they do. And that was their designation. So, I was just coming out of grad school and I said, I think I see a problem. And I wrote comment letters. Part of the reason I was able to do this is I went to law school because I was so interested in how you draw the connection between actionable science and the policy representation. So I was able to write the legal documents that obligated the regulator to respond. But they didn't want to do anything about it. So they denied all the accusations, and I was left with trying to go to academic colleagues and to the press. And one of the most complicated things with these issues is that academic colleagues are often interested parties in these questions. And it was very difficult to be working at a state university talking about these kinds of issues. So that was an issue. And the other thing I'll mention is trying to work with journalists. I mean, you're a journalist, you get a phone call from somebody who said, oh, I just finished graduate school. And I think I found a major problem with the state regulation.
No, we would have listened because one of the people that we used he was a graduate student from another country who was here, and he had done some groundbreaking research, and he got in a lot of trouble for it. He thought he was going to lose his, and we used his stuff, so we would have listened. But
now, supposing a senior person, you said, I want to check this out, and I call somebody else, and they say, oh, it's no big deal. Now what do you do?
What do you mean a senior?
A senior economist in your field in the same area says, I've also looked at that, I don't think it's a major issue.
No, because you know something, we've been around too long now. I mean, I hate to say it, but we really don't trust. It's not that we think people are telling us lies, but people have their own agendas. And one of the reasons I have to tell this story about Lisa Song, that when I started working with her, I'd never worked with a scientist before who thought like a scientist. And so she was just doing a little daily story. And I didn't know her. She was 24 years old when I started working with her. And I said, you know, I think you probably ought to call a lawyer about this, you know, get someone to comment. And she said, I've already called 6 lawyers. And I thought, yes! But, so, you know, because of her scientific background and our reporting background, we don't. But to defend other journalists, most journalists do not have the time. And that we had a tremendous luxury. Right. We had a tremendous luxury. And that's why this kind of work is disappearing and why it's more important than ever. Because journalists have to have the time. You have to have the time if you're going to read the scientific papers. You're going to have the time to chase down the graduate student who may be a flake and may not. You know, you don't know when that call comes in. And you are going to have the guts when a bigwig says, oh, that can't be true. You're going to have to listen to that little voice in your head that tells you to make some more calls because this bigwig may have something else going on. But that takes time. And right now, people don't have the time.
I'll say one other thing. One of the projects we did at Stanford at the end of my graduate school experience was bringing late-stage graduate students who are interested in the connection between science and policy and bringing them into actual regulatory processes. So I encourage every graduate student, get involved as a public stakeholder, as any individual can, but especially those who are trying to develop expertise. Go and show up at a regulator and participate in a process and understand how it works and the conversations that happen between stakeholders and the regulators. And that makes people much better at being able to communicate what matters to journalists and to the media and in social media and just the broader conversations that need to be had about the way we govern our society. And the more that the scientific community can be engaged in that process, I think the better that it is. But at the same time, it's a very difficult process because you have to trade off really significant norms in the scientific community about independence and respectability, which are threatened when I stand up and say something controversial. And if I'm right in time, maybe that'll work out. If I'm wrong, that destroys my career as a scientist. And I think that's a real risk profile that we have to engage with, especially in the connection with journalists.
Well, one of the stories that we did not do, remember the scientist story that we had talked about with Lisa? Lisa came across the stories of so many scientists who had really faced great difficulty because they had done research in an area that wasn't popular. One woman, someone sat down and said, you know, you're nice children, you have 3 nice children. It was not a very veiled threat, and we've had scientists who have been sued repeatedly, even after the judge says they're not part of this case, they have nothing to do, they are added back again and again and again, not because they have any money to get, but to keep them from doing their work. So one of the stories on our agenda was we were going to take 10 scientists and we were going to tell their very personal stories. And we thought this would be a good way to illustrate it, but we had great ambitions. We didn't quite get there.
But you found 10 scientists that would be able to speak in a way that your audience would understand. Yes. I think that's a challenge.
Well, and no, because some of them, what we were going to do is get 2 or 3 of them to speak publicly and use their names. And the other ones, we felt that we could justify using them unnamed because they were already in jeopardy. And I thought that was really interesting, and we had talked this through. But Lisa, she got people to trust her because they knew that she was obsessed with getting things right. We all were. We were all sort of nutty about that. So,
Madeline, I wonder if in doing the work that you're doing here in California, you found challenges in working with journalists in getting those stories, a broader audience. I know you guys worked on making your own media with the What the Frack campaign, and was that in part because you felt like you had to just start doing it on your own?
Well, we wanted to make sure we communicated as broadly and as deeply with a young audience intentionally, and so we use social media. We partner with more online organizations, advocacy organizations like 350.org and Movement Generation, who helped us with those spots. We've worked with incredible journalists in California. Unfortunately, I think because they're so good at their job and because there's so many scandals, the status quo, no, I mean, quite truthfully, it was just, we uncovered collectively one after another from 2013 to now, with, revolving door of regulator going back to Chevron going to the just everything, gross negligence. And, it's on the cover of the LA Times, it's in The Guardian, we're on Chinese 60 Minutes, Rodrigo is telling his story, but you get so many hits and people just kind of have an apathy or tune out, or they accept that kind of disaster, the disaster element that entices the public to weigh in on a tragedy like Flint that's happening right now is lost when it's just seen as, oh, every day we're going to expect this one agency to be terrible, for the governor to be a hypocrite, and for X, Y, and Z to go down, and that usually, the same group of people, residents in the Central Valley and in Southeast Los Angeles, are going to continue to pay the price. So I haven't had a problem getting journalists to answer my calls because I think, especially we work with people. It's not, what I offer them is not necessarily my legal expertise, but really my connection to my clients and what it's like to be in an advocacy space, which has been something that journalists thankfully have covered. I think they've done a great job. I think it's a very big problem that we want to offer a ladder of engagement, a lower rung, with some of this more humorous, meme-oriented content that we've generated, so folks kind of want to learn more and want to dig into these larger investigative pieces, including young voters and young Californians who we serve and we were trying to reach.
Okay, great. We want to give you all in the audience a chance to ask questions of our panel. We've got a few minutes for that, and we have a microphone right there in the middle. So I'd encourage any of you who'd like to ask questions of the panel to come up and make use of the mic.
I do have a question, but before I ask it, when I was up there presenting the awards earlier, I meant to thank the judges of this contest because there were 5 of them, I think, and they had a lot of entries to go through, and they did. And I mentioned it because one of the judges is here with us today, and I wanted to thank her publicly, Felicity Behringer, who's a national she's a national environmental correspondent for the New York Times, based here. I'm sure you've seen her byline many times in the Times, so thank you, Felicity. The question I wanted to ask was, we've had this recent incident that seems like it's related to what you're all talking about, the methane leak from the wells in Southern California, which seems like a lot of the same things happened. The industry said it's no problem, and people questioned the people who said they were getting sick. One of the things that was different about it was in a very well-to-do neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of these people then had to move out of their homes, and they got quite a bit of attention for that. I just wonder if any of you have any thoughts about that whole thing, or know anything about how and why it happened, and how the press coverage or the regulatory handling of it has been.
Well, I can start.
Please do.
And in my full disclosure, I do work in coalition with Save Porter Ranch, which is a group of residents that are impacted still by the perhaps, who knows, capped leak at the Aliso Canyon facility. I think, you astutely pointed out the difference in demographics. I work with low-income communities and communities of color that are overwhelmingly disproportionately in California, in Texas, and around the globe impacted by these issues. And what was interesting to me as an environmental justice advocate and someone working in coalition and offering some technical assistance to allies in Porter Ranch is still how bad the state response was. You have a lot of wealthy folks who are not going to put up with being exposed, that had the money to voluntarily relocate. The discussion of relocation, they weren't given funds to do so, and a lot of that was resident driven, and I think it has to do with access to money and resources, and also education, that this community of folks knew what to do and who to ask, and had the resources to take a precautionary approach in the absence of any meaningful state information. But the state, I worked with folks in the Central Valley for a natural gas leak in Arvin over a number of years, which took over 2 years to detect. And the difference in demographics and disparate responses from state entities, but still, looking at Arvin and Porter Ranch, the industry and the state is saying the same thing that you both said, which is it's safe. These are acute, temporary symptoms. It's really, if you feel uncomfortable, you can leave. And I was in Los Angeles a few weeks ago at a hearing where a gentleman from the LA County Health Department is just pulling really suspect science out of thin air, which is, well, there's no data, so green light, you're all safe, don't worry about it. And then SoCal Gas is literally tweeting with the LA County and tagging his official government Twitter, saying see, it's safe, we're friends, we like him, he likes us, and they posed for a literal picture at this hearing, which was one of the quote-unquote regulators in this space. The Air Board similarly didn't do meaningful monitoring. There has been a lot of community-driven data from both academic institutions and from the residents themselves that have shined a light on the chemical additives question that our law and our technology is behind on protecting folks from. So we don't truly know, and instead of having a precautionary principle approach to this situation, the regulators, even in this situation, took a very non-confrontational, everything's fine, calm down approach. But we did see, an emergency declaration from the governor. We've seen national and international coverage that similar gas leaks that have been happening, at the Jefferson drill site a mere 10 miles away in southeast Los Angeles has never or will never get. And it's a more densely populated area, and there are more vulnerable residents that still haven't had meaningful notification. So that was long, and I apologize. But to me, I thought they would do better here, I guess is a short summary, they meaning the state. And they really didn't. When a disaster strikes, I was in Santa Barbara for the oil spill last year, when a disaster strikes, there's no real meaningful protective response. We know these accidents are going to occur, and our regulators are in a state of incredible denial, and really are unwilling to go against one of the largest, most powerful industries in the history of the world when their funding continues, to decrease, and they face personal and professional risk.
I'd add to that, I think that one of the most complicated issues is what do you do after a disaster, and what's the right policy response? And that's one of the hardest things, I think, to generate journalistic interest on and to follow up and to stay on track. So I'm very glad that's one of your interests going forward. It's easy to get coverage for a disaster.
It is easy.
It's wonderful that we've gotten so much attention on this problem. The follow-up is the hard part.
Yeah, the follow-up. And the follow-up can also be more interesting, actually, because that's when you really get the good stuff and when people trust you. And I think it's one of the things Jim said, it's too bad we're not in Texas now, because after 18 months, what was it that you said that they're finally beginning, at first they just brushed us off. They thought we were going away. And then it sort of dawned on them that we weren't. And if we could have stayed, we would have probably had better, even more success. Because people were getting a little nervous.
Yeah.
Another question?
Hi, I'd like to ask you to enlarge on a point that you made about the Clean Air Act. Number one, that it's aged, and number two, that it needs to be revised to cope with modern technology and modern science and so forth. And we can also probably agree that the chances of that happening in the near term are the chances of a snowflake in a frying pan. But I also understood you to say that implementation of the Clean Air Act becomes a state responsibility. And if that is correct, can you say which state is doing the best job? What can be learned from that, and how can it be improved?
So let me take that last question first. I don't think it's possible to say which state is doing the best job. It's really complicated. It depends on the issue, and it's really contextual. The grand bargain of the Clean Air Act was a tension between the idea that the federal government can and should impose standards for environmental quality, and the idea that local governments and local states are better positioned to make those kinds of trade-offs and to tailor the rules to adjust the needs of the local stakeholders, including industry, as well as the local population. And there's always it's a great spectrum of how that works and how well that works, and it's very much in the eye of the beholder. I think your work showed, from my point of view, a pretty compelling case that Texas is not paying very close attention, or at least as much attention as the law would afford them to if they were interested. And you might say that was a bad job. Certainly there are agencies that have exceeded state standard, or the federal standards in some cases, and that's great. But it really depends on the specific issue, and it has so much to do with the complexity of the different sources, whether we're talking about power plants or oil and gas development or cars or agricultural pollution. Yeah. These are radically different scientific and social structures that generate the pollution. Have very different consequences for how you manage it. So I think that's really too hard to answer.
And you have to compare the laws that are on the books with the way they're enforced. Yep. Because I have to confess now, I've been more educated tonight, and I'm really depressed about California, because as Dave Hassmeyer...
They're doing a great job on a lot of things. Yeah.
But Dave Hassmeyer and I, because he's a really obsessive reporter, and we would talk every single morning and every single night about this story, and he was always, oh, what I found today. But every night we would close with, well, aren't we glad we live in California? So now but having the laws on the books is not the same. And also the other thing, one of the reasons that I really am interested in this experimenting with our new organization is that after these events, you all know that politicians come out and they promise things, and we are going to write new legislation, and then everything disappears and everything dies down and no one holds them accountable. And sometimes the legislation is, written and proposed and whatever, but if you look at that legislation, it may sound all glossy and great on the outside, and then you dig in and you find, just like you said, there are built-in loopholes, built in. So you have to be skeptical all the time, and I don't know who else can do that job but journalists. I don't know if there's advocacy groups do a great job, but they're advocacy groups, and we've at Inside Climate News, we got great tips and worked with people, but we didn't quote advocacy groups at the top, because you have to have someone who's going to stand back and look at the whole picture, and I don't know who else that is but us. Another question.
Hi. Two questions. First, Jim, you mentioned a scientist who had offered free monitoring to some of these communities and been refused. Do you know if he was refused by community leaders who were somehow wanting to protect the industry, or were these people who were hopeless about it, simply just didn't want to know what they were being forced to breathe?
It was the former. He had gone to, small town mayors and county judges in South Texas and said, hey, I can bring my device to your county, and they said, no thanks.
And I'm also curious if this series has sparked, what effect it's had on the state and local press in Texas, if any.
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
we don't monitor it, now that closely. There was some good reporting. Was it the El Paso paper did? San Antonio.
Right.
No, there was some good reporting, and that's one of the cool things is we hope that other people pick up on this. And that's one of the bonuses of journalism in this era. It used to be much more competitive and in a different way, and now it's a sign of success, we feel, if people take up our reporting and go down on the local level, because we can't do that.
Let me just say something briefly about the last comment about, if a scientist volunteered, oh my God, it's horrible that this didn't happen. And I think that's probably true in this case, but one of the challenges in the scientific community is that if we have the journalistic edge, if we say, oh, there's a story there, we want to go for that, we lose our objectivity pretty quickly. And so a nice counterexample is there's a big controversy within the scientific community about the methane emissions from oil and gas development. And different players within the scientific community are fighting over who's credible and whether or not one party was too aggressive in their advocacy to bring in monitoring of some of the first developments in the Marcellus Shale. And that causes a great controversy within the scientific community as well. So there's big tensions. As much as I'd like to say, oh, just call a scientist, that changes the dynamic.
Yeah.
Although I would note that we found him. He didn't come to us. So, and he was, you remember him, right? Very quiet. He was not looking for publicity.
Yeah. No, he just he cared. He was from Texas.
He was from Houston, yeah.
Yeah, he cared. But you're right, and we see that in the scientists, and that's been true in the climate change debate too.
I think in addition to that, there's a political will problem where if you do get the scientist that goes out there to generate objective data and they do find something, in Kern County, I've more than one occasion from each type of regulator, I've heard presence doesn't equal risk. So they find it, but there's technological disagreements on, how much, where, for how long, how long was this monitor on, where was the wind blowing, and you have 40 industry scientists in comparison to, the extra credit time of a community scientist that is likely employed elsewhere. And then you have the regulator knowingly put their head in the sand. So there is, it is about influencing and holding those decision makers accountable as well, even when scientists and journalists are doing wonderful jobs against all odds.
I should also just say, just for a little balance, I've also been the lone scientist in the room and had regulators say, oh, thank you, that's very helpful.
Yes.
And
That's
we're
true.
focusing on such a controversial area. I think it's easy to, I agree with you about the political dynamic on oil and gas.
County is a tough area to deal with.
Sure.
Regulators, but certainly, and then you do hear, oftentimes we also get like anonymous envelopes from unknown regulators
Who care.
that have gone above and beyond, but I certainly, it's not a critique for all regulators everywhere, but there is a lot of political pressure on them, and in California there's been a real struggle for them to stand up to it.
We just have a few more minutes, so I want to make sure that we get to our last question here.
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist myself, but I'm wearing a slightly different hat and bringing this up.
Can you pull the mic down? We can't hear you very well.
I'm a journalist myself, but I'm wearing a slightly different hat. I wanted to ask you if any of you have heard of the Dakota Access Pipeline. You're all in the environmental field. So so as a journalist, I'm just extremely frustrated, and maybe you have some advice. For the last few years, there's a Texas oil pipeline company that's proposed a 1,200-mile pipeline from the Dakota fields to the Mississippi River to go underground under all the farmland in North Dakota, across all of Iowa and Illinois to get to the river. And there have been many efforts made. The Des Moines Register has been writing a lot. It's at a final stage now where the state of Iowa is trying to decide whether to grant eminent domain to this oil company to dig up the farmers' fields for 1,000 miles across the state. And there have been efforts made by environmental groups and others to get the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal interested in writing about this. It's a disaster that hasn't happened yet. It's been a political battle to no avail, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on changing that. Unfortunately, there hasn't been an explosion yet, but if there were to be a leak, it could be disastrous.
What kind of pipeline?
Oil pipeline.
Oil.
Because Congress has, well, maybe this was being anticipated, but since Congress has changed the rules on export of oil, all this oil will be exported.
I would suggest one thing, that I would suggest that you go and get the ebook that Inside Climate News did called The Dilbert Disaster. And because it really, they won the Pulitzer Prize.
Is that the one you mentioned about Michigan?
Yeah, and you want to read that because it tells you how the pipeline industry works, how the regulatory system works. It really goes into minute detail, and so there's stuff there that you can arm yourself with, but and you will see yourself, and you will see this problem.
So had any of you heard of this?
I had not heard of that one, and I just wrote it down because I'm going to make calls because it's interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and just like the Keystone Pipeline was the same issue, and that was vetoed, and that was a hook, and it just fell on deaf ears, except for the Des Moines Register, which has been doing a great job.
I would think actually some of the best reporting on the Keystone issue came with the state decisions in Nebraska and some of the local concerns that Nebraskans raised about the land use and permitting decisions, and I wonder if there's a connection to make with that story.
We can continue this conversation. There's a reception outside that you are all invited to. Our panelists will be with us, and we encourage you to keep the dialogue going with them. And thank you so much for coming and being a part of the symposium and celebrating the wonderful work that Jim and Susan have done.